When leaving his surgery on the morning of April 16th, Dr. Bernard Rio felt something soft under his foot. It was a dead rat lying in the middle of the landing. On the spur of the moment, he kicked it to one side and, without giving it further thought, continued on his way downstairs. Only when he was stepping out onto the street did it occur to him that a dead rat had no business to be on his landing, and he turned back to ask the concierge of the building to see its removal. It was not until he noticed old M. Michael's reaction to the news that he realized the peculiar nature of his discovery. Personally, he had thought the presence of the dead rat rather odd, no more than that. The concierge, however, was genuinely outraged. On one point he was categorical. There weren't no rats here. In vain the doctor assured him that there was a rat, presumably dead, on the second floor landing. M. Michael's conviction wasn't to be shaken. There were no dead rats in the building, he repeated. So someone must have brought this one from outside. Some youngster trying to be funny, most likely. That evening, Dr. Rio was standing in the entrance, feeling for the latchkey in his pocket before starting up the stairs to his apartment. He saw a big rat coming towards him from the dark end of the passage. It moved uncertainly, and his fur was soaking wet. The animal stopped and seemed to be trying to get its balance. It moved forward again towards the doctor, halted again, then spun around on itself with a little squeal and fell on its side. Its mouth was slightly open, and blood was spurting from it. After gazing at it for a moment, the doctor went upstairs. He wasn't thinking about the rat. That glimpse of spurting blood had switched his thoughts back to something that his mind had been on all day. His wife, who had been ill for about a year now, was due to leave the next day for a sanatorium in the mountains. He found her lying down in the bedroom, resting, as he had asked her to do. In the view of the exhausting journey before her, she gave a smile. "Do you know, I'm feeling ever so much better," she said. The doctor gazed down at the lamp, gazed down at the face that turned toward him in the glow of the bedside lamp. His wife was 30, and the long illness had left its mark on her face. Yet, the thought that came to Rio's mind as he gazed at her was, "How young she looks, almost like a little girl." But perhaps that was because of the smile, which effaced all else. "Now try to sleep," he consoled. "The nurse is coming at 11, you know, and you have to catch the midday train." He kissed the slightly moist forehead. The smile escorted him to the door. Next day, April 17th, at 8 o'clock, the concierge buttonholed the doctor as he was going out. Some young scallywags, he said, had dumped 3 dead rats in the hall. They'd obviously be caught in traps with very strong springs, and they were bleeding profusely. The concierge lingered in the doorway for quite a while, holding the rats by their legs and keeping a sharp eye on the passerbys, on the off chance that the miscreants would give themselves away by grinning or by some fictitious remark. His watch had been in vain. "But I'll nab 'em all right," said M. Michael hopefully. Much puzzled, Rio decided to begin his round in the outskirts of town, where his poorer patients lived. The scavenging in these districts was done late in the morning, and as he drove his car along the straight, dusty streets, he cast glances at the garbage cans along the edge of the sidewalk. In one street alone, the doctor counted as many as 12 rats deposited on the vegetable and other refuse in the cans. He found his first patient, an asthma case of long standing, in bed, in a room that served as both a dining room and a bedroom, and overlooked the street. The invalid was an old Spaniard with a hard, rugged face. Placed on the coverlet in front of him were 2 pots containing dried peas. When the doctor entered, the old man was sitting up, bending his neck back, gasping and wheezing in his efforts to recover his breath. His wife brought a bowl of water. "Well, doctor," he said, while the injection was being made. "They're coming out, have you noticed?" "The rats, he means," his wife explained. "The man next door found 3. "They're coming out!" You can see them all in the trash cans. It's hunger. Rio soon discovered that the rats were the great topic of conversation in that part of town. After his round of visits, he drove home. "There's a telegram for you, sir, upstairs," and Michael informed him. The doctor asked him if he'd seen any more rats. "No," the concierge replied. "There haven't been any more. I'm keeping a sharp lookout, you know. Those youngsters wouldn't dare when I'm around." The telegram informed Rio that his mother would soon be arriving the next day. She was going to keep house for her son during his wife's absence. When the doctor entered his apartment, he found the nurse already there. He looked at his wife. She was in a tailor-made suit. And he noticed that she used a robe. He smiled to her. "That's splendid," he said. You're looking very nice." A few moments later, he was seeing her into the sleeping car. She glanced around the compartment. "It's too expensive for us, really, isn't it?" "It had to be done," Rio replied. "What's this story about rats going by?" "I can't explain it. It certainly is queer, but it'll pass." Then hurriedly, he begged her to forgive him. He felt he should have looked after her better. He'd been most remiss. When she shook her head as if to make him stop, he added, "Anyhow, once you're back, everything will be better. We'll make a fresh start." "That's it." Her eyes were sparkling. "Let's make a fresh start." But then she turned her head and seemed to be gazing through the car window at the people on the platform, jostling one another in their haste. The hissing of the locomotive reached their ears. Gently he called his wife's first name. When she looked around, he saw her face wet with tears. "Don't," he murmured. Beneath the tears, the smile returned, a little tense. She drew a deep breath. "Now off you go. Everything will be all right." He took her in his arms, then stepped back on the platform. Now he could only see her smile through the window. "Please, dear," he said, "take great care of yourself." But she could not hear him. As he was leaving the platform near the exit, he met M. Othon, the police magistrate, holding his small boy by the hand. The doctor asked him if he was going away. Tall and dark, M. Othon had something of the air of what used to be called a man of the world, and something of an undertaker's assistant. "No," the magistrate replied. "I've come to meet Madame Othon, who's been to present her respects to my family." The engine whistled. "These rats now," the magistrate began. Rio made a brief movement in the direction of the train, then turned around back towards the exit. "The rats," he said. "It's nothing." The only impression of that moment which afterwards he could recall was the passing of the railroad man with a box full of dead rats under his arm. Early in the afternoon of that day, when his consultants were beginning, a young man called on Rio. The doctor was gathered that he had been called before in the morning and was a journalist by profession. His name was Raymond Rambert. Short, square-shouldered, with a determined-looking face and keen, intelligent eyes, he gave the impression of someone who could keep his end up in any circumstances. He wore a sports type of clothes. He came straight to the point. His newspaper, one of the leading Paris dailies, had commissioned him to make a report on the living condition prevailing among the Arab population, and especially on the sanitary conditions. Rio replied that these conditions were not good, but before he could say any more, he wanted to know if the journalist would be allowed to tell the truth. "Certainly," Rambert replied. "I mean," Rio explained, "would you be able to publish an unqualified condemnation of the present state of things?" "Unqualified? Well, no, I couldn't go that far, but surely things aren't quite so bad as that?" "No," Rio said quietly, "they weren't so bad as that." He had put the question solely to find out if Rambert could or couldn't state the facts without plagiarizing with the truth. "I have no use for statements in which something is kept back," he added. "This is why I shall not furnish information in the support of yours." The journalist smiled. "You talk the language of Saint Just." Without raising his voice, Rio said that he knew nothing of that. The language he used was that of a man who was sick and tired of the world he lived in, though he had as much liking for his fellow man, and had resolved for his part to have no truck with injustice and compromises with the truth. His shoulders hunched. Rampart gazed at the doctor for some moments without speaking. Then, I think I understand you, he said, getting up from his chair. The doctor accompanied him to the door. It's good of you to take it like that, he said. Yes, I understand, Rampart repeated, with what seemed a subtle hint of impatience in his voice. Sorry to have troubled you. When shaking hands with him, Rio suggested that if he was out for curious stories for his paper, he might say something about the extraordinary numbers of dead rats that were being found in the town just now. Ah, Rampart explained, that certainly interests me. On his way out at 5 for another round of visits, the doctor passed on the stairway a stocky youngish man, with a big, deeply furrowed face and bushy eyebrows. He had met him once or twice in the top floor apartment, which was occupied by some Spanish dancers. Puffing a cigarette, Jean Thurl was gazing down the convulsions of a rat dying on the steps in front of him. He looked up, and his gray eyes remained fixed on the doctor for some moments. Then, after wishing him good day, he remarked that it was rather odd, the way that all these rats were coming out of their holes to die. Very odd, Rio agreed, and it ends by getting on one's nerves. In a way, doctor, only in a way. We've not seen anything of the sort before, that's all. Personally, I find it interesting. Yes, definitely interesting. Tarot ran his fingers through his hair to brush it off his forehead, looking again at the rat, which had now stopped moving, then smiled towards Rio. But really, doctor, it's the concierge's headache, isn't it? As it so happened, the concierge was the next person Rio encountered. He was leaning against the wall besides the street door. He was looking tired, and his normally rubicund face had lost its color. Yes, I know, the old man told Rio, who had informed him of the latest casualty among the rats. I keep finding them by 2s and 3s, but it's the same thing in the other houses in the street. He seemed depressed and worried, and was scratching his neck absent-mindedly. Rio asked him how he felt. The concierge wouldn't go so far as to say he was feeling ill. Still, he wasn't quite up to the mark. In his opinion, it was just due to worry. These damned rats had given him a shock. Like, it would be a relief when they stopped coming out and dying all over the place. Next morning, it was April 18th, when the doctor was bringing back his mother from the station. He found M. Michael looking still more out of the sorts. The stairway from the cellar to the attics were strewn with dead rats, 10 or a dozen of them. The garbage cans of all the houses in the street were full of rats. The doctor's mother took it quite calmly. It's like that sometimes, she said vaguely. She was a small woman with silver hair and dark, gentle eyes. I'm so glad to be with you again, Bernard, she added. The rats can't change that anyhow. He nodded. It was the fact that everything seemed easy when she was there. However, he rang up the municipal office. He knew the man in charge of the department concerned with the extermination of the vermin, and he had asked him if he'd heard about all the rats that were coming out to die in the open. Yes, Mercier knew all of it. In fact, 50 rats had been found in his offices, which were near the wharves. To tell the truth, he was rather perturbed. Did the doctor think it meant anything serious? Rio couldn't give a definite opinion, but he had thought the sanitary service should take action of some kind. Mercier agreed. And if you think it's really worth the trouble, I'll get an order issued as well. It is certainly worth the trouble, Rio replied. His chairwoman had just told him that several hundred dead rats had been collected in the big factory where her husband worked. It was about this time that our townsfolk began to show signs of uneasiness. For from April 18th onwards, quantities of dead or dying rats were found in factories and warehouses. In some cases, the animals were killed to put an end to their agony. from the outer suburbs to the center of town, in all the byways where doctors' duties took them. In every thoroughfare, rats were piled up in garbage cans or lying in long lines in the gutters. The evening papers that day took up the matter and inquired whether or not the city's fathers were going to take steps and what emergency measures were contemplated to abate this particularly disgusting nuisance. Actually, the municipality had not contemplated doing anything at all, but now a meeting was convened to discuss the situation. An order was transmitted to the sanitary service to collect the dead rats at daybreak every morning. When the rats had been collected, the 2 municipal trucks were to take them to be burned in the town incinerator. But the situation worsened in the following days. There were more and more dead vermin in the streets, and the collectors had bigger truckloads every morning. On the 4th day, the rats began to come out and die in the batches. From basement cellars and sewers, they emerged in long, quavering files into the light of day, swayed helplessly into a sort of puriette, and fell dead at the feet of horrified onlookers. At night, in passages and alleys, the shrill little death cries could be certainly heard. In the mornings, the bodies were found lining the gutters, each with a gout of blood like a red flower on its tapering muzzle. Some were bloated and already beginning to rot, others rigid, with their whiskers still erect. Even in the busy heart of the town, we found some of them piled in little heaps on landings and in the backyards. Some stole forth to die singingly in the halls of public offices, in school playgrounds, and even on cafe terraces. Our townsfolk were amazed to find such busy centers as the Place des Armes, the boulevard, the promenade along the waterfront, dotted with repulsive little corpses. After the daily cleanup of the town, which took place at sunrise, there was a brief reprise. And then, gradually, the rats began to appear again in numbers that went on increasingly throughout the day. People out at night would often feel underfoot the squelchy roundness of a still warm body. It was as if the earth on which houses stood were being purged of its secret humors, thrusting up into the surfaces of the abscesses and pus cots that had been forming in its entrails. You must picture the consternation of our little town, hitherto so tranquil, and now, out of the blue, shaken to its core. Like a quite healthy man who all of a sudden feels his temperature shoot up and the blood seething like wildfire in his veins. Things went so far that the Ranstock Information Bureau inquiries on all subjects promptly and accurately answered, which ran a free information talk on the radio by way of publicity, began its talk by announcing that no less than 6,231 rats had been collected and burned in a single day, April 25th, giving as it did an ampler and more precise view of the scene. Daily enacted before our eyes, this amazing figure administered a jolt to the public nerves. Hitherto, people had merely grumbled at the stupid, rather obnoxious visitation. They now realized that this strange phenomenon, whose scope could not be measured and whose origins escaped detection, had something vaguely menacing about it. Only the old Spaniard whom Dr. Rio was treating for asthma went on rubbing his hands and chuckling. They're coming out! They're coming out! With senile glee. On April 28th, when the Ranstock Bureau announced that 8,000 rats had been collected, a wave of something like panic swept the town. There was a demand for drastic measures. The authorities were accused of slackness, and people who had houses on the coast spoke of moving there. Early in the year, though it was. But next day, the Bureau informed them that the phenomenon had abruptly ended, and the sanitary services had collected only a trifling number of rats. Everyone breathed more freely. It was, however, on the same day at noon that Dr. Rio, when parking his car in front of the apartment house where he lived, noticed the concierge coming towards him from the end of the street. He was dragging himself along, his head bent, arms and legs curiously splayed out with the jerky movements of a clockwork doll. The old man was leaning on the arm of a priest woman whom the doctor knew. It was Father Pennylow, a learned and militant Jesuit, whom he had met occasionally, and who was highly thought of in our town, even in circles quite indifferent to the region. Rio waited for the two men to draw up to him. Michael's eyes were fever bright, and he was breathing wheezily. The old man explained that, feeling a bit off color, he had gone out to take the air, but he had started feeling pains in all sorts of places, in his neck, armpits, and groin, and had been obliged to turn back and ask Father Pennylow to give him an arm. "It's just swelling," he said. "I must have strained myself somehow." Leaning out of the window of the car, the doctor ran his hand over the base of Michael's neck. A hard lump, like a knot in wood, had formed there. "Go to bed at once and take your temperature. I'll come see you this afternoon." When the old man had gone, Rio asked Father Pennylow what he made of this queer business about the rats. "Oh, I suppose it's an epidemic they've been having." The father's eyes were smiling behind his big round glasses. After lunch, while Rio was reading for the second time the telegram his wife had sent him from the sanatorium announcing her arrival, the phone rang. It was one of his former patients, a clerk in the municipal office, ringing him up. He had suffered for a long time from a constriction of the aorta, and, as he was poor, Rio had charged no fee. "Thanks, doctor, for remembering me, but this time it's somebody else. The man next door has had an accident. Please come at once." He sounded out of breath. Rio thought quickly. Yes, he could see the concierge afterwards. A few minutes later, he was arriving at a small house in the A few minutes later, he was entering a small house in the Rue Fred-Hervé. On the outskirts of town, halfway up the drafty, foul-smelling stairs, he saw Joseph Grand, the clerk, hurrying down to meet him. He was a man of about 50 years of age, tall and drooping, with narrow shoulders, thin limbs, and a yellowish mustache. "He looks better now," he told Rio, "but I really thought his number was up." He blew his nose vigorously. On the top floor of the third, Rio noticed something scrawling in the red chalk on the door on the left. "Come in, I've hanged myself." They entered the room. A rope dangled from a hanging lamp above a chair on its side. The dining room table had been pushed to a corner, but the rope hung empty. I got him down just in time. Grant seemed always to have trouble finding his words, even though he expressed himself in the simplest possible way. "I was going out, and I heard a noise. When I saw that writing on the door, I thought it was a prank. Only then I heard a funny sort of groan. It made my blood run cold, as they say." He scratched his head. "That must have been a painful way of doing it, I should think. Naturally, I went in." Grant had opened the door, and they were standing on the threshold of a bright but scantily furnished bedroom. There was a brass bedstand against one of the walls. A plump little man was laying there, breathing heavily. He gazed at them with bloodshot eyes. Rio stopped short. In the intervals of the man's breathing, he seemed to hear little squeals of rats, but he couldn't see anything moving in the corners of the room. Then he went to the bedside. Evidently, the man had not fallen from a sufficient height, or very suddenly, for the collarbone had been held. Naturally, there was some asphyxia. An X-ray photograph would be needed. Meanwhile, the doctor gave him a camphor injection and assured him he would be all right in a few days. "Thanks, doctor," the man mumbled. When Rio asked Grand if he'd noticed the police, he hung his head. "Well, it's a matter of fact I haven't. The first thing I thought was to." "Quite so," Rio cut in. "I'll see to it." But the invalid made a fretful gesture and sat up in bed. He felt much better, he explained. Really, it wasn't worth the trouble. "Don't feel alarmed," Rio said. "It's a little more than a formality. Anyhow, I have to report this to the police." "Oh," The man slumped back on the bed and started sobbing weakly. Grant, who had been twirling his mustache while they were speaking, went up to bed. "Come, Master Goddard," he said. "Try to understand. If you look into your head, to have another shot at it." "Come, Monsieur Goddard," he said. "Try to understand. People could say the doctor was to blame if you took it into your head to have another shot at it." Goddard assured him cheerfully that there wasn't the least risk of that. He'd had some sort of crazy fit, but it had passed, and all he wanted to do now was to be left in peace. Rio was writing the prescription. "Very well," he said. "We'll say no more about it for the present. I'll come and see you again in a day or two, but don't do anything silly." On the landing, he told Grant that he was obliged to make a report, but he would ask the police inspector to hold up the inquiry for a couple of days. "But somebody should watch Carter tonight," he added. "Has he any relations?" "Not that I know of, but I can very well stay with him. I can't say I really know him, but one's gotta help a neighbor, hasn't one?" As he walked down the stairs, Rio caught himself glancing into the darker corners, and he asked Grant if the rats had quite disappeared in this part of town. Grant had no idea. True, he had heard some talk about rats, but he never paid much attention to gossip like that. "I've other things to think about," he added. Rio, who was already in a hurry to get away, was already shaking his hand. There was a letter to write to his wife, and he wanted to see the concierge first. News vendors were shouting the latest news that the rats had disappeared, but Rio found his patient leaning over the edge of the bed, one hand pressed to his belly and the other to his neck, vomiting pinkish bile into the slop pail. After retching for some minutes, the man lay back again, gasping. His temperature was 103. The ganglia of his neck and limbs were swollen, and 2 black patches were developing on his thighs. He now complained of internal pains. "It's like fire," he whimpered. "The bastard's burning me inside." He could hardly get the words through his fever-crusted lips, and he gazed at the doctor with bulging eyes that his headache had suffered with tears. His wife cast an anxious look at Rio, who said nothing. "Please, doctor," she said. "What is it?" "It might be almost anything. There's nothing definite as of yet. Keep him on a light diet and give him plenty to drink." The sick man had complaining of a raging thirst. On returning to his apartment, Rio rang up his colleague Richard, one of the leading practitioners in the town. "No," Richard said. "I can't say I've noticed anything exceptional. No cases of fever with local inflammation. Wait a bit. I have 2 cases of inflamed ganglia. Abnormally so?" "Well," Richard said, "that depends on what you mean by normal. Anyhow, that night the porter was running a temperature of 104 and in a delirium, always babbling about them rats." Rio tried a fixation abscess. When he felt the sting of turpentine, the old man yelled, "The bastards!" The ganglia had become still larger and felt like lumps of solid fibrous matter embedded in the flesh. Michael had completely broken down. "Sit up with him," the doctor said, "and call me if necessary." Next day, April 30th, the sky was blue and slightly misty. A warm, gentle breeze was blowing, bringing with it a smell of flowers from the outlying suburbs. The morning noise of the street sounded louder, gayer than usual. For everyone in our town, this day brought the promise of a new lease on life, now that the shadow of fear under which they had been living for a week had lifted. Rio, too, was in an optimistic mood when he went down to see the concierge. He had been cheered up by a letter from his wife that had come with the first mail. Old M. Michael's temperature had gone down to 99, and though he still looked very weak, he was smiling. "He's better, doctor, isn't he?" his wife inquired. "Well, it's a bit too early to say." At noon, the sick man's temperature shot up abruptly to 104. He was in constant delirium and had started vomiting again. The ganglia in his neck were painful to the touch, and the old man seemed to be straining to hold his head as far as possible from his body. His wife sat at the foot of the bed, her hands on the counterpane, gently clasping his feet. She gazed at Rio imploringly. Listen, he said. We'll have to move him to a hospital and try special treatment. I'll ring up for the ambulance. 2 hours later, the doctor and Michael were in the ambulance, bending over the sick man. 2 hours later, the doctor and Madame Michael were in the ambulance, bending over the sick man. Rambling words were issuing from the gaping mouths, thickly coated with swords. He kept on repeating, them rats, them damned rats. His face had gone livid, a grayish green. His lips were bloodless. His breath came in sudden gasps. His limbs spread out by the ganglia, embedded in the berth as if he were trying to bury himself in it, or a voice from the depths of the earth were summoning him. Below, the unhappy man seemed to be stifling under some unseen pressure. His wife was sobbing. Isn't there any hope left, doctor? He's dead, said Rio.